By talking a little bit about some of the work I've done in the Middle East, mainly in Turkey, southeast Turkey. And, throughout the semester, I'd like to bring up some of my experiences where they're relevant, or share any stories from the field. Let's see how many years ago. A few years ago, I was assistant director of a project in southeast Turkey. The site was called Mardine Tepe. A lot of the sites that we talk about, you're going to see, have names possibly identifiable from ancient history. This particular site, though, didn't have any writing found in it, so we don't know what the ancient people called this site. But the modern name of the people who live near it today is Mardine Tepe. We're going to talk about different sites in the Middle East. A lot of sites are called tells. Right? We'll talk more about that. Tepe is another word for tell. It's actually a Persian word for tell. So this is the view standing from the archaeological site looking over at the Tigris River. And one of the things that's interesting about working in Mesopotamia, I've worked about here on the Euphrates, and I've worked right here on the Tigris. The ancient names for the Tigris and the Euphrates are very similar to the modern names. So it's really kind of amazing to be living, working in an area of the world where the history is all around you. This project, like the project I worked on the Euphrates, was a salvage excavation, and you're going to read about that in the Matthew's chapter on the history of archaeology. What that means is dams were being constructed on the Tigris and the Euphrates, and the site was going to be flooded. Which means that we had to do as much archaeological work as we could before that happened. So this is an area, I was working in an area of what we might call northern Mesopotamia. It's really almost the fringe of Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia proper is further south in southern Syria and also Iraq. And this is an interesting part of the world. So you could see I was not too far from the Syrian border. I'm going to show you the Syrian border. And you could see that the site was located right on the Tigris River, like I showed you from that view. Here are some of the other sites along the river, and the modern-day city of Diyarbakir over here, and the modern-day city of Batman. Yes, no relation to Batman. You could see the site from Google Earth. Google Earth and satellite imagery, as many of you know if you've taken archaeology courses, is really, really important in archaeology today. This was a tell, which, as you're going to see, is a mound created from human occupation. We excavated a portion of the site, and one thing that you find in many sites throughout the world, and especially the Middle East, any site that is about, from 6,000 BC, 5,000 BC, up to the present, you're going to find lots and lots of pottery. And pottery are one of the essential artifacts for archaeologists to analyze, to answer very basic questions about prehistory, the ancient world, and also specific questions about the site. Why do we find so much pottery in archaeological sites? Well, there's really two reasons. Well, there's a few reasons, but really two important reasons, I think. One is that pottery and ceramic vessels, as you can see here, break. So they have to be constantly replaced. However, what they are made out of is ceramic. This is a synthetic substance. It's baked clay. It won't degrade. It won't rot away. It won't dissolve in water. Right? So they constantly are throwing things away when they're broken, but the substance that it's made out of is virtually indestructible, which means that this stuff is going to pile up in trash deposits and houses and things like that and it's not going to rot away. It's going to be there essentially forever. And because it was replaced so often, a lot of it is left behind. But you can tell a lot from pottery. One of the basic things archaeologists use pottery for is to develop a chronology. That is, to try and figure out the time periods that the site dates to, maybe even the culture. Right? If you've taken archaeology classes, archaeologists like to say that pots do not equal people. However, we kind of work almost on the assumption that they do, right? Especially when we're talking about, let's say, a site or a culture where we don't know the name of the people, we don't have any writing, right? We would just term the culture of this region based on their material remains, which is what archaeology studies, the material remains. And so we might call this the red, brown, washware culture, which is, of course, not a very romantic name, but it's just a purely descriptive name of their specific style of pottery that dates to this particular time period. And so within the Middle East, and we'll see this when we talk about Halaf culture, Ubaid culture, right? You could identify geographic regions or, by pottery style, and you can also use pottery style to identify time periods. Within a single time period, you may have a variety of pottery styles over a wide range. Right? Okay, you can see there was some similarity. We thought, at least in the beginning, we changed our minds later to this kind of style that was found in Syria. And so we thought there might have been a connection, but it turns out there probably was not. But you can see the sort of wash, it's called, where you actually use a thin layer of clay dissolved in water and you apply it over the vessel before you fire it, and that creates a nice sort of outer coating, smooth outer coating. And so this red outer coating is specific to this pottery style, as well as the shapes of the vessels. That's another important thing archaeologists study, is the shapes, the rim shapes, the diameters, the overall body shapes of the vessels. You can see there's a variety of vessels here. There's jars that could be used for storing liquids, cooking bowls, serving bowls, right? All of these have different functions. By looking at the kind of pottery found in different parts of an archaeological site, you could identify maybe the functions in terms of what was going on at that particular area of the site. So here's the site over here, and one of the other things that we found, this is a sketch of some of the buildings that we discovered in the Middle East. Mostly what you find are the remains of buildings, usually the foundations of walls, maybe the first course of bricks of the walls on top of the stone foundations, but that's about it. You rarely, if ever, get intact buildings. Nothing like the stone temples and tombs you see in Egypt. It's interesting because Egypt has remarkable preservation of those stone tombs and temples. That's one of the things that makes Egypt so appealing. But you don't get good preservation in Egypt of palaces or houses. Palaces and houses look like houses and palaces and other buildings in the Middle East, because those houses and palaces in Egypt were made of mud brick, like they were in the Middle East. Right? So you're not going to see a lot of pictures of palaces in books, because palaces in Egypt, because they're a little less dramatic than the preserved stone temples. So this is mainly what you get, with artifacts in situ, hopefully, in place on the floor, which will allow you to tell you what these rooms were used for. So in one part of the site, what we found were some interesting objects. We found over here mortars and pestles, probably used for grinding grain. But over here in this area, we found these clay artifacts. This is an example from northern Mesopotamia, from Iraq, of something that's similar. These were clay, they were decorated, they had some sort of anthropomorphic figure in the middle, and some sort of little spout at the bottom, probably for liquids. Now, the old joke about archaeologists is when you don't know what something is, you say it's religious in nature. In this case, though, it probably is true. These don't look like tools, so they probably had some sort of religious function. So excavating at the site, we were able to look at the religion of the society, we were able to look at production of agricultural products, and we also found, you can see, a stone mold, half of a stone mold. Liquid bronze would be poured in to form a axe, and very similar to a stone mold that was found in another part of Turkey. Okay, this site is not too far from an ancient crossroads of history that we're going to learn about, the old Assyrian trading colonies. We'll talk about people from northern Mesopotamia who came up to now what's modern-day Turkey to trade with local people. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about what it's like to work on archaeological sites such as this. Because we have to work in the summer. We work in the summer for a couple of reasons. One, that's usually when the academic year is over. Two, it's also when local people, usually farmers in rural areas, have downtime. They usually harvest their wheat crop in May or June. Then they burn the stubble, or they let the sheep and goats eat the stubble. And then they're kind of freed up for a little bit. And so they're happy to get hired, on a local excavation to make a little extra money. We get to work with local people and train them, and they learn about archaeology. But because there's no, because they are free to work, that is a big help in the summer. And also there's no cover from wheat, so you can actually see artifacts on the ground as well. Right? I worked in Turkey as a graduate student, and then, as I said before, also while I've been here as a professor. I've taken students a number of times to Turkey to work on this ancient site that on the Tigris River. These are 3 former Grand Valley students who came with me to Turkey in, I think it was 2006. Amy Schlosser over here is now the head archaeologist in Moab, Utah, in the, I think it's in the Forest Service. Okay, so let's look at archaeological sites in the Middle East. Well, we said this is a tell. This is actually a natural hill, but on top of it is a human-created hill. You see these kinds of things all over the Middle East. This is one of the most common forms of site in the Middle East. Right? Now, what you see here is there's no natural hills around. It's flat, and then you have this mound sticking up maybe 60 feet. Here's another good example. Right? Flat, flat, flat. There's no hills except way off in the distance. And then you have this mound that's just sticking up. It looks out of place. It is out of place. It's entirely human created, not deliberately constructed over a short period of time. It's unconsciously built over a very long period of time from trash and buildings, abandoned buildings, building up layer by layer over time. Right? So you can see this in action if you go to the Middle East today. We lived in a pretty rural area. It was a small village that we lived in. It was only about 15 houses or so. Many of the houses were made out of mud brick. Mud brick today is still one of the best substances to build buildings from for a variety of reasons. You can see, if you look around, why you would not build a log cabin. There's very little tree cover here anymore. What we found out from digging in our archaeological site, we found lots of deer bones, and we also took soil samples from the site and had someone analyze the pollen. And what we discovered is that when our site was occupied around 4,000 years ago, this whole area was forest. It looks like humans probably cut down the trees, most likely for fuel. And then because of sheep and goats that they had, the trees never grew back. And so you had permanent deforestation in the area. Right? So you have a little bit of rainfall. You don't have any trees. What do you have? Well, you have lots of mud and you have lots of clay. So if you mix up the earth, the mud, and the clay together, and you put it into molds to make bricks, you can then stack those bricks to form a mud brick house. And mud brick homes are actually very, very comfortable because they're usually warm in the winter and they're pretty cool in the summer. They block out the heat. There's a little bit of transpiration. So compared to cinder block, mud brick is much better. The problem, though, is that mud brick, if it's just sun-dried, eventually it's going to start to decay. Cinder blocks will probably last forever, and they're cheap, and that's one of the reasons why people use a lot of cinder blocks today. But people still use mud brick. So in a mud brick house, the first thing usually to go is the roof. Roof collapses. Then you have this abandoned house, and maybe you build a new house next to it. What do you use the abandoned house for? Well, trash. That's what it's actually very, very good for. People would not go very far to throw their trash away. They would just go right next door and dump their trash. Eventually, those walls would collapse, and then you would level that piece of land off, and you would build a new mud brick structure on top of it. Right? And over time, what you'd end up with, after, let's say, thousands of years of people living in the exact same spot, right, building houses one on top of the other, is you end up with a tell, which is the Arabic word, again, for mound. And so you will see tell sites all over the Middle East. And tells are one of the most common forms of archaeological sites. And we're going to look at a lot of tells in this class. Not all archaeological sites are tell sites, but many of them are, which makes some tells easy to spot. Okay. In the site, this is another former Grand Valley student, and he's excavating a tomb. This happened to be a teenage girl that had beads and was buried also with bronze earrings. Okay, well, this is what it looks like as we're excavating. Sometimes we usually think of archaeologists using toothpicks and dental tools and small brushes and things like that. And yes, we use those things in levels that are undisturbed. But in some contexts, the contexts are basically trash deposits, which means that you don't want to go too slowly. You want to recover the artifacts, but nothing is in place anyway, right? I mean, it's sort of thrown into an ancient trash pit. So you're not going to gain much by mapping its exact location. You're going to pay attention to levels, and you're going to sort things out according to levels. But you're not going to, let's say, excavate with a toothbrush. You're going to use the wheelbarrows and things like that. So here you see us cutting into the tell and going back in time, layer by layer. The more recent levels are closer to the surface. The older layers are further down. So we're essentially digging from most recent to older. And as we excavate, we separate pottery and stone tools and animal bones and things like that by the room location they're found in and the level, the actual stratigraphic level. You can see the different strata or levels here in which they're found. Right? So there's a lot, it almost looks chaotic. There's a lot of things going on at once. Archaeologists kind of have to keep, many things happening at the same time. For certain areas where, let's say, you're inside the room level and it's undisturbed, everything is in situ or intact, Then you'll dig very slowly, and you'll take that material and you'll sift it in a screen so that you could get even the very smallest artifacts. Documentation, of course, is very, very important. Writing everything down, mapping in the architecture, taking levels as well is also extremely important. Right? And then at the end, you'll actually get the stratigraphy of the tell. So here you could see some of the levels that were found in our site. And again, older levels are beneath younger levels. That's the law of superposition, it's called in archaeology. Right? After the mapping, and here you could see a mortar, and then we would draw that in. We would have this as a scale so that later on we know how large the walls are and things like that. And then we begin the process of conservation. We might reconstruct vessels like this very large jar, or maybe high detail conservation, trying to make a pottery vessel look almost like it was new again. Usually, because it gets very hot in the Middle East in the summer, we would usually start work at around 5 a.m. Because by noon, it's usually over 100 degrees in this part of Turkey. So we would usually work from about 5 to about 12:30, and then go back to the village and wash pottery and do analyses and things like that. So a lot of archaeology in the Middle East is done working sort of in the early morning, and then the afternoons are usually spent doing kind of analysis work on the artifacts. This is us taking a breakfast break. You can see here, hanging out by the Tigris. You can see students, got to experience local culture. This was mainly a Kurdish area, so you can see the kind of way the kafia is tied in the kind of Kurdish style. We also took field trips to different sites. One site, which was really interesting, unfortunately, is now being flooded. A lot of the site is already underwater, unfortunately, is a place called Hasan Cave. Hasan Cave is right on the Tigris River, an ancient crossing point. You can see the ancient Roman bridge and the modern bridge. They downstream on the Tigris, they built a hydroelectric dam. So now the water levels has increased. This is part of a human-created lake. Just to give you an idea of how hot it can sometimes get there, as we were driving to Hasan Cave, we heard a big bang, and we had to pull over our van. And it turns out it was so hot that the asphalt on the road started to melt a little bit, and our tire treads got stuck to the asphalt. And as the wheel turned, the treads on the tire got completely sheared off. But the site Hasan Cave goes back to prehistoric times, before history. And then there are historic remains, like this Islamic tomb that you can see here. People still live in caves in this area. And, I remember asking myself, why would people still want to live in caves? And then when I went inside the cave, I found out immediately, because inside the cave it was about 20 degrees cooler than it was outside. So it was a naturally cool environment. Of course you're going to build inside of a cave. Another nearby site that we would visit is a city called Mardine. This is right on the mountains overlooking Syria. So it's right at the border between Turkey and Syria. And so this is kind of the view looking up on that hill. And from the hill looking south, you can see the flat plains of Syria. And on a clear day, you can see tells in the distance that correspond to ancient cities. Many excavations actually going on in those cities. Right? What I've been doing in the past few years is a little bit different. I've still obviously want to go back to the Middle East and do more work there, but I've been doing a little bit of work using robotic submarines in the Great Lakes to look at ancient shipwrecks. Okay, well, let's get into a little bit of the Middle East and also the history of archaeology in the Middle East.